Man, do I got a story for you guys. This vulnerability had no public exploit, no proof of concept, just a description on the page. I pretty much took that, pulled the firmware apart off of this router, found the vulnerability, and turned it into a working weapon. This router lives in millions of homes, and until I did this, nobody proved that it was actually exploitable. And if I figured this out, you can too. Here's how I did it. Yo, what's up, what's up? Wanted to bring a cool little story for you guys regarding some vulnerability research and reverse engineering efforts I've been doing. And what better way of bringing my first long form content to you guys other than highlighting some IoT hacking I've been doing. I have a quote unquote old Netgear Nighthawk RAXE300 router. This is about 2 years old, give or take, and the firmware hasn't been updated on it in about 2 years. As I began ripping through some of the firmware, I dumped some of the firmware on it. Luckily, I had Squash FS up and running, analyzed the file system, and I had access to all of the library files, all of the binaries that were existent within the router's file system itself. And from there, I was able to enumerate the whole attack surface of the router itself. My current version was vulnerable to CVE 2025-12943. And what is that, you're wondering? Well, this is improper certificate validation and the firmware update logic within the actual router itself. I was running a vulnerable version. What makes this even better and more attractive to me, at least, is there's no public exploit or publicly available proof of concept for this specific vulnerability right here. And I thought this was going to be a really great idea because, in my opinion, one thing that's extremely slept on in vulnerability research and just in the whole security research and cybersecurity industry in the first place is end-day weaponization. Everybody is extremely afraid of the zero-day threat, which they should be. It's a very honest and extremely scary threat to the whole entire landscape of the technical industry. But honestly, if we take a step back, end-day weaponization, that's actually really insane. Because especially whenever you're just breaking down the door and getting into vulnerability research, one thing that many researchers don't think about is the fact of, the job has been already done for most of these CVEs, these end-day vulnerabilities. And you're probably thinking, well, what's the fun in that? Well, one, this is really, really good practice. Two, there's no publicly available proof of concept for it. So you're saving so much time on this, it's actually insane. So you can rapidly turn over the effectiveness of this end-day weaponization because you actually know where to look and how the vulnerability fundamentally works. You might not know exactly which library it's in, which function is affected. This is going to give you an idea of how the vulnerability works. Let's do something fresh. I've been doing a lot of reverse engineering of software lately. Let's do some IoT stuff. Let's bring something back to the tangible physical realm. To do that, then weaponize in an end day and be able to do some stuff. And yeah, that was just a little bit of background for you guys. I felt like that was necessary to drive the narrative forward. Now I'm going to show you exactly how I was able to plan this out and get this up and running. This one is actually not connected to a WAN port whatsoever, but one way that we can trick it into thinking that we're actually connected to the internet is using a rogue DNS server, so doing some DNS poisoning, as well as I attempted a rogue DHCP server. That didn't end up working out too much, but really the biggest ones are a fake HTTPS server, which it can think that it's fetching the firmware from Netgear's official servers in the cloud, as well as DNS resolving from Netgear as well. And all you gotta do is just point that to your box using fake DNS and HTTPS servers. You can achieve that, and you can arbitrarily serve firmware or a malicious script directly to this router with a self-signed cert. And I'm gonna pop this up right here. This command right here is called curl, and it actually is one of the standards that most IoT devices will go out and use whenever they're fetching new firmware. And what the -- insecure flag does is that doesn't enforce a known or at least a recognized certificate that's signed for the firmware or whatever's being served to the router. So in that case, the attacker armed with that knowledge can leverage that. They can serve their own self-signed certificate binary or piece of firmware, and they can actually leverage that to hijack control of the router. Put a backdoor on it like I did, and be able to weaponize this and carry out whatever they want to do after that. And what makes end-day weaponization so slept on and so valuable is just the fact that not a lot of people think about this, but there's still a lot of routers out there that are still vulnerable to this. So I'm enumerating all of our network interfaces, and we can find EN0 in my case, and we get it automatically assigned to the router's DHCP server 192.168.1.3. That tells me automatically that our default gateway is going to be 1.1 typically. So we can go ahead and open up our browser, and we can browse to our default gateway right up here. And after authenticating, we can check our version right here, and then RAXE300, which is the one that we're talking about, 1.09.82 or later. So we are significantly behind, which means that there's multiple different vulnerabilities that are going to be targeting this router, but we're just going to be focusing on CVE 2025-12943 because we already have that weaponized. So firmware image really quickly, just the version. You can actually grab it directly from this endpoint right here just by directly curling it. So wanted to just show you guys that real quick. All we have to do is just Google dork for Netgear RAXE300, and we can do firmware download, and then we can actually dork for netgear.com. So this is only gonna populate results with the Netgear site itself. Yeah, that looks better. RM-F RAX. Yep. Perfect. Okay, so we can go ahead and unzip that guy right there. Firmware. And yeah, that looks a little bit better. Okay, so what we can do after that is we have the newer firmware. Now we can go ahead, and if we look back at our, let me see here, if we go back to our web browser, we can see we're running version 1.0.7.62_1. So we can actually use that same command. There we go. There we go. So we have our two versions right there. Let me go ahead and unzip the older version for us. Okay, perfect. We can see that right there. Now we have both of those. So we have the new and the old versions right here. So going back to our CVE website right here, we can actually see from the National Vulnerability Database that CVE 2025-12943 stems from improper certificate validation and firmware update logic. Okay, we know that much, but without actually ripping into the firmware and losing our minds for a little bit and spending time, instead of actually wasting all of our time reverse engineering and going line by line, disassembly, instruction by instruction by instruction, function by function, what we can do is we can actually bin walk. And what bin walking is bin walking is very, very beautiful. It's actually a tool that allows us to bin diff, or binary difference, the two versions that we actually pulled down, and that's the old and the new version. And essentially think about it like this. So we can take firmware A, firmware B. We can stack them on top of each other, metaphorically, and we can actually lay them directly on each other and find differences or similarities within the binaries. And those similarities or differences can actually point us in the right direction of what part of the code base was actually patched out for that specific function right there, or that specific vulnerability right there. And that's going to point us in the right direction. That is going to propel us to be able to perform our vulnerability research with higher due diligence and definitely way more efficiency. We can start ripping apart for various different libraries. And yeah, you can actually see there is quite a bit of stuff going on here. In green, we actually see exactly what we're looking for. This is our squashfs file system. So what we can actually do now is we can extract the squashfs file system and decompress it just like this. So we're just going to wait for that to kick off really quickly. and then we're going to decompress the file system immediately after the squashfs file system has been extracted using DD. So this is going to take a second. I'll be right back when this is done. Alright, so finally you can see that DD has successfully extracted the squashfs file system, and I just wanted to point out something very interesting really quickly. So with DD, we go ahead and pass the firmware image right there, but we're skipping this particular block in memory right here. And that is going to preserve the squashfs file system, so that way we can go ahead and we can extract that. We don't get all this extra fluff that we have to worry about going through, and it's just going to make our jobs way easier. Decompress that, and we can actually use unsquashfs to help us out right there. SQSH file. It's going to go ahead and decompress that for us. And one thing that we can begin doing is we can go ahead and, so let me just show you really quickly. It just created a whole new file directory right there. We can go ahead and we can begin checking it out. So if we go ahead and just ls that out, this is going to list out every single file, every single binary, every single library that's on this guy right here. And that's going to make our lives so much easier, so that way we don't actually have to do this on the live system. So you can go through bin, look at all of the different binaries that are associated within this particular router itself. You can go to all kinds of different stuff, like there's cd var, and you have webs as well. Webs is usually a good one. So this is going to point us in the right direction of all of the endpoints that our 192.168.1.1 address can actually hit. So we can just pick a random one, and we can go curl http://192.168.1.1. Go ahead and put that guy right there, and you can see we're going to get something because we're curling directly against our default gateway. Yes, so what's so amazing about this is essentially we unlock the root file system for this router. We can go ahead and we can enumerate it just like we landed on a fresh box. I use binary diffing, and we can actually put this command in right here. So we have the diff binary itself, and essentially what we're doing is we're parsing through the shared object library that contains the exact change for the vulnerability itself and the patch itself. And you can actually see our library right here, libpu_util.so, and we can actually parse that out using sorts, and then use string, redirect that output into the newer version of libpu_util.so, and we can actually grep that out for various different changes in the code base. So scrolling up a little bit more, what we can actually see is we actually see our curl binary, and it looks very, very different. So we actually see curl -- insecure, and then we see -- ca cert. So -- ca cert is actually what the patch is itself in the newer .09 firmware, and the firmware that's running on my router right now is leveraging the -- insecure flag to pull down firmware images. So just to highlight exactly what's going on here, -- insecure is what's running on and being passed as a parameter on my old firmware, which is on my router right now. And we're actually using -- ca cert, which is a predetermined and agreed upon certificate between the router and Netgear. And we're actually using %s, which is parameterized, which is actually parameterized inputs and arguments for the curl function and binary itself, which is a lot more secure than actually passing it something like what we're going to learn is snprintf for the older version, in addition to -- insecure, whereas the new version is using the parameterized argument passing as well as a system call. So it's using execv as a system call to go ahead and formulate this curl command right here. Whereas with -- insecure, pretty much any arbitrary self-signed cert or any cert in the first place is going to be agreed upon. And that's because it's in an else condition, and this is a very insecure block of code that is entered if there is no other type of option, and it's kind of like a nuclear option, and the router just wants to update anyways, but it actually threw itself into a vulnerable code path that opened up the door, and compromise the overall attack surface of the router. So pretty fascinating stuff that the developers of Netgear actually shot themselves in the foot by using this one flag and put. The next best thing that you want to go ahead and do is you want to load this up in the Ghidra. And one big thing that I leverage Ghidra for, especially whenever I'm reverse engineering IoT devices or something similar like software and software patches, there's all kinds of use cases for this. You can go ahead and analyze both of these firmware images inside of Ghidra. I was hinting at -- insecure and snprintf and execv earlier. And so you can actually click in here and this will actually take you directly into the code path inside of Ghidra. And you can actually see right here, this is going to take us directly to where the implementation of the firmware update logic actually occurs. And you can see right in here, this is what it's going to go in. And you can see on the right side, we have the old firmware version, and on the left side, we have the new firmware version. So on the left side, what we can actually see is going on the newer version, we can see that system call using execv, and it's using bin curl to go ahead and fetch that latest firmware image. Now on the right hand side, we have our older firmware version, which is leveraging snprintf and this vulnerable else conditional block. And we can see curl with the -- insecure flag, and that is the vulnerability itself. So that means that if we can fall into this else block right here and give it the exact conditional logic that we need to fall into this insecure code path, we can actually provide a self-signed certificate for during a man-in-the-middle attack using a rogue DNS server as well as a fake HTTP server. We can act like we are Netgear's official firmware updating page and in the cloud. And what we can do is we can actually trick the router on the WAN side, the wide area network side, into thinking that we are the update server, but we're actually attacker controlled. We can provide it an attacker controlled firmware image or malicious script that we can go ahead and push it onto the router and get arbitrary remote code execution. We see local 54 actually still has -- insecure right there. It's actually going to sanitize that parameter right there to make sure in the new code path that that's not being used. But on the right side, we can actually see that this is just blindly being sent using -- insecure on the right. So like I said, that's our exact vulnerability that we're going to be leveraging in this guy right here. All right, so now the next step of the exploit chain is we're going to go ahead and set up this man-in-the-middle attack. And just to give you a little bit of a rundown of what the topology looks like, we're going to be setting up a fake DNS server in addition to an HTTPS server. Since we are connected to that endpoint and all of our traffic is being now funneled for the DNS server through our computer, we can actually start to see some of that Netgear traffic. So going back right here, we can go ahead and kick off our router update, and we can start seeing fetches and spoofed IP addresses and domains that are reaching out to the Netgear firmware update page. And that's actually going ahead and that's actually forwarding it to ours. So I'm just going to go ahead and show you that the TLS handshake is actually going through, and you can actually see that right here. Let's go ahead and kick this off one more time just so you can check this out, and it's going to drop after 10 packets. And you can see right here, we are forwarding everything directly through my default gateway. This is my new default gateway on that specific internet or Ethernet interface right there, and it's communicating from the router to my computer right here. So I'm going to be taking a little bit of a detour. I'm going to be doing this a little bit differently. In the real world, the attacker is actually going to push a remote malicious firmware image to the router. So I made a decision. I didn't want to completely create a custom malicious firmware image just to save time on this, just because this is kind of just for free time. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to emulate exactly what a malicious firmware push would actually do to the router. So in a real attack, the attacker is never ever going to need shell or root access to the computer. I'm only doing this because I did not want to create a full malicious firmware image, just because I'm doing this out of my free time. So just to save some time, what we can actually do is we can go ahead and we can serve the telnet enabler Python script, and we can essentially enable telnet. That is going to allow us to telnet into it, allow us to gain that shell, and we can actually emulate the curl with the dash dash and secure flag using our maliciously placed and uploaded firmware image that we uploaded earlier. So we can go ahead and we can log in right here. You can see that I enabled this. Before, it wouldn't let me do this unless I did that. You can see I can. And one thing that we have to do is we can type help. Okay, that's really cool, but we want to actually escape this. We can use echo, and then we can actually use shell injection with the semicolon and pass that bin shell. That's going to land us in a busy box. And what we can actually do from here is we can emulate exactly what the malicious firmware would do, this curl right here. So let's get that HTTPS server up and running. Go ahead and enter in my password. And let's go ahead and try this one more time. You can see that this is going to be served up right here. And you can see our host name is the RAXE300. This is going to give us some information about the kernel. The method of the get and post instructions for the HTTPS request is saying dash dash and secure. And that was leveraged, used, and supported by the libpu_util.sharedObject library right there. You can go ahead and telnet into this guy right here, and you can see that we're running using the utelnet daemon right here backdoor. We can actually go ahead and telnet into the router using the default gateway address, and with the new port right here, 55555, we can go ahead and authenticate without any authentication whatsoever. And it would be way cooler to do it with a malicious firmware image, but just to save time and show you guys that this is just a proof of concept, and that's exactly what we're emulating the firmware to do, just in a quicker manner. But nonetheless, this does highlight exactly how that CVE works, and I figured you guys would absolutely love this. So yeah, this was tons of fun. This is my first long form content video. I hope you guys really loved it. I'm super passionate about this stuff. I do, if you guys are new here, I do cybersecurity content all the time. Reverse engineering and vulnerability research is my forte. I do have a background with red teaming and penetration testing, but reverse engineering and vulnerability research is where my heart is. So if you guys like this and you want to see more in the future, definitely let me know down below what you want to see. Like, subscribe, and yeah, I'll see you guys soon.